Just hours ago, something shifted. Not on a battlefield, not in a war room, not in the headlines most people are reading right now. It shifted inside a pipeline, inside a power line, inside a calculation that Washington made years ago and has never revisited since. And that calculation is now a liability so enormous, so quietly devastating, that intelligence analysts and grid security experts are only beginning to understand what it actually means. What happens if Canada turns off America's power? Not as a hypothetical, not as a thought experiment, but as a negotiation move, as a real executable strategic option sitting on a desk in Ottawa right now. The answer to that question will change how you see this entire trade war. And once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. This is Power Shift Decoded, where the real moves happen before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this now, because what you are about to hear is not being discussed anywhere near loudly enough. In the last 24 hours, as the tariff war between the United States and Canada has escalated to levels not seen in the modern era of North American relations, a quiet but profound realization has been spreading through energy security circles on both sides of the border. The United States, the most powerful military and economic force in human history, has a vulnerability, a structural, deeply embedded, almost embarrassing vulnerability. And Canada, the country that Washington has been treating as a junior partner in this trade confrontation, is holding the key to it. Here is the reality that most Americans do not know. Canada supplies roughly 60% of all crude oil imported into the United States. Not a small slice, not a supplementary share, 60%. And that number alone would be staggering. But that is not even the full picture, because Canada also supplies approximately 85% of all electricity that the United States imports from foreign sources. 85% of cross-border electricity flows, running through transmission lines into New York, into New England, into the Midwest, into the Pacific Northwest, into states and cities that have built their energy infrastructure around the quiet, reliable assumption that Canada will always keep the lights on. Nearly 3.6 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods cross that border every single day. The economic artery between these two countries is not a trickle. It is a flood. And right now, that flood is being threatened. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is what happens when you begin to understand how deeply the northeastern United States is wired, literally wired, into Canadian energy systems. Military analysts are already warning that this dependency represents one of the most underappreciated strategic vulnerabilities in North America. Because unlike oil, which can be rerouted and substituted over weeks and months, electricity cannot wait. Electricity is instantaneous. The moment it stops flowing, the consequences begin. Not tomorrow, not in a week, within hours. Think about what 36 states means. Think about the Northeastern Corridor. Think about Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Detroit, Minneapolis, Seattle. These are not small communities on the edge of a grid. These are economic engines. These are population centers. These are the nodes of the American economy. And intelligence reports suggest that a partial disruption to Canadian electricity exports into these systems, not a total cutoff, not a dramatic shutdown, just a managed, deliberate partial reduction, would be enough to trigger rolling blackouts across the northeastern grid within days. This is where things get worse. Because here is what the tariff architects in Washington appear to have missed, or perhaps chose not to think about. The United States entered this trade confrontation under an assumption. That assumption was that Canada is the weaker party. Canada exports more to the United States than it imports. Canada's economy is smaller. Canada cannot absorb a prolonged trade war the way America can. Therefore, Canada will eventually fold, eventually negotiate down, eventually accept whatever terms Washington puts on the table. That was the logic. And on the surface, that logic is not entirely wrong. Canada does depend on the American market enormously. Canadian industries, from automotive to agriculture to manufacturing, are deeply integrated with the U.S. economy. So yes, Canada feels the tariff pain. Canada feels it acutely. But the calculation that was missed, the thing that was never fully priced into the tariff strategy, is that Canada has one card that has nothing to do with trade volumes or GDP ratios or export dependency percentages. Canada has an energy card. And that card, if played, does not just hurt the United States economically. It destabilizes it physically. It hits not the stock market first, but the power grid and everything attached to the power grid, which in the modern era is everything. The truth is, this was never supposed to happen. The North American energy relationship was built on the assumption of perpetual cooperation. The two countries share the world's longest undefended border. They share NORAD. They share defense treaties. They share a cultural and historical relationship unlike almost any other between two sovereign nations. The idea that Canada would ever consider weaponizing energy exports was not just politically unthinkable, it was structurally unthinkable. The infrastructure was designed for integration, not confrontation. The pipelines, the transmission lines, the trade agreements, all of it was built on a foundation of trust, so deep it was invisible. Nobody put it in the risk assessments because nobody thought it needed to be there. And that is exactly what makes this moment so dangerous. Because Ottawa is now thinking about it. Quietly, carefully, behind closed doors, with advisors and energy ministers and grid operators, Canada is running the numbers. And the numbers are not what Washington assumed they would be. Defense experts understand that when a nation discovers it holds a weapon it never planned to use, the mere existence of that weapon changes the entire negotiation. You do not have to use it. You only have to let the other side know that you have it. Let's talk about what a partial energy cutoff actually looks like in practice, because this is where the technical reality becomes genuinely alarming. The northeastern United States grid, known in technical terms as part of the Eastern Interconnection, pulls power from Canadian provinces, most significantly from Quebec through Hydro-Quebec and from Ontario. Hydro-Quebec alone has export agreements with New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and other New England states worth billions of dollars annually. These are not supplementary sources. For states like Vermont and Maine, Canadian hydropower represents a foundational portion of their electricity supply. What this means is that if Ottawa were to reduce electricity export volumes by even 20 to 30%, not a full cutoff, just a managed reduction framed as a domestic supply prioritization measure, the downstream effects would cascade immediately. Independent system operators, the entities responsible for keeping the grid balanced in real time, would face a deficit that alternative sources could not fill quickly enough. Natural gas peaker plants, which are the backup systems designed to handle demand spikes, can't spin up fast enough or at sufficient scale to replace hydroelectric baseload power. Nuclear plants are already running at capacity. Solar and wind, despite enormous recent investment, remain intermittent and regionally insufficient. And the interconnections with other U.S. grid regions, while they exist, have limited capacity to push enough power northeastward fast enough to prevent localized shortfalls. And that's where everything breaks down. Because a shortfall does not just mean the lights flicker. A shortfall in a modern power grid triggers a cascade. When supply drops below demand in one zone, the grid compensates by pulling from adjacent zones. Those adjacent zones then experience their own deficits. The system begins to oscillate. Grid operators begin implementing controlled load shedding, which is the technical term for deliberately cutting power to certain areas to protect the wider system. And if the deficit is large enough and persistent enough, that controlled load shedding escalates into uncontrolled cascading failures. We have seen this before. The Northeast blackout of 2003 affected 55 million people across 8 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces. The initial trigger was not a foreign adversary. It was a software bug and an untrimmed tree touching a power line. What the 2003 blackout demonstrated, and what grid security experts have been saying ever since, is that the northeastern grid is simultaneously highly sophisticated and deeply fragile. Now imagine not a software bug or a fallen tree, but a deliberate, sustained reduction in supply from the country that powers a significant portion of that grid. Military analysts are already warning that the speed of escalation in such a scenario would exceed the response capacity of even the best prepared grid operators. The system would not fail all at once. It would fail incrementally, then suddenly, predictably, then catastrophically. Rolling blackouts first, measured in hours, then extended outages measured in days. Then, if the reduction persists, something that begins to look less like a power interruption and more like a regional infrastructure crisis. But here is something deeper, something that almost nobody is talking about. The dependency is not just electrical, it is economic in a way that is invisible until it stops. Think about what runs on electricity, not just lights and heating and air conditioning, which are critical enough on their own. Think about data centers. Think about the server farms that run financial clearing systems, hospital networks, emergency services dispatch, water treatment plants, transportation logistics platforms. Think about cold storage for food supply chains. Think about fuel pumping stations, because in the modern world, even gasoline does not flow without electricity to run the pumps. When a grid goes under strain, the cascade does not stay inside the power system. It bleeds into every system that power touches. And in a modern economy, that is every system, full stop. Defense experts understand that in a conflict short of war, energy is the most powerful lever that exists. It does not require a missile or a sanction or a trade restriction that takes months to bite. It requires a decision, a controlled reduction, and time. The discomfort is immediate. The pressure is immediate. And crucially, the party applying the pressure does so without firing a single shot, without violating a single treaty, and with complete deniability, because any reduction in exports can be framed as domestic energy management, not as retaliation. Now, let's be precise about the options available to Washington in this scenario, because intelligence reports suggest that the options are fewer and worse than anyone in the administration wants to admit. Option 1, increase domestic energy production to compensate. The problem is that this takes years, not days. New pipeline capacity, new transmission infrastructure, new refinery capacity. None of this exists in sufficient scale to be deployed on the timeline that a crisis demands. The energy independence narrative, however popular politically, does not translate into grid independence on the northeastern seaboard in any time frame that matters for an acute crisis. Option 2. Source electricity from other U.S. regions. The problem is transmission capacity. The grid is not uniformly connected. Moving large quantities of power from, say, Texas or the Midwest into New England requires transmission infrastructure that does not currently exist at the necessary scale. The United States has been debating and delaying major transmission expansion for decades. That debate does not resolve itself in the middle of a crisis. Option 3, impose counter-sanctions or escalate the trade war. The problem is that this is precisely the approach that is creating the leverage problem in the first place. Escalating tariffs on Canada does not reduce Canadian energy exports faster than it increases Canadian willingness to use energy as a weapon. The harder Washington pushes, the more attractive the energy card becomes for Ottawa. Each escalation step strengthens the hand of Canadian policymakers who argue that conventional trade negotiation is no longer sufficient. Option 4, appeal to international frameworks or dispute mechanisms. The problem is that trade disputes through the WTO or under the CUSMA agreement, formerly NAFTA, move on timescales of months to years. A grid crisis does not wait for a panel ruling. By the time any legal mechanism produces a result, the damage is done. Option 5, negotiate down from the current tariff position. This is, analytically speaking, the most rational option, but it is also the option that carries the heaviest political cost for an administration that has framed the tariff war as a test of strength and a matter of national economic sovereignty. Walking back tariffs on Canada in response to energy pressure would be read domestically and globally as precisely the capitulation that the tariff strategy was designed to prevent. And this is where you reach the conclusion that no one in Washington wants to state out loud. There is no clean option. Every path available carries a significant cost. And the longer the tariff war continues at its current intensity, the more the energy leverage equation tilts toward Canada, because Canada can sustain the pressure of reduced trade revenue far longer than the northeastern United States can sustain a compromised power supply. The global reaction to this dynamic is already beginning to crystallize. European capitals are watching. Asian strategic planners are watching. Because what is unfolding between the United States and Canada is not just a bilateral trade spat. It is a live demonstration of a principle that has enormous implications for every energy-dependent economy in the world. Energy is not a commodity. Energy is power, and the country that controls the flow of energy into another country's grid holds something more significant than a trade advantage. It holds a structural lever over the functioning of modern civilization inside that country's borders. Intelligence reports suggest that several of America's strategic competitors are studying this situation with intense interest. The playbook that Canada is quietly developing, whether or not it is ever fully executed, is a playbook that others will note. The weaponization of energy dependency is not a new concept in global geopolitics. Russia demonstrated it in Europe for years. But the application of that concept within what was supposed to be the most stable, most integrated, most mutually trusting bilateral relationship in the world is something different. It is a rupture in an assumption, and ruptured assumptions have a way of spreading. This changes everything, not just about the Canada-U.S. relationship, about how the world understands North American strategic stability. For decades, the assumption was that North America was uniquely insulated from the kind of energy leverage dynamics that afflicted Europe or Asia. Canada and the United States were not just allies. They were, in practical terms, a single integrated economic and energy space operating under two flags. That assumption underwrote an enormous amount of strategic planning, military posture, and economic infrastructure investment on both sides of the border. If that assumption is now in question, the downstream consequences extend far beyond any specific tariff rate or any specific energy export volume. What we are watching in real time is the moment when economic nationalism collides with physical infrastructure dependency, when the abstraction of trade policy meets the concrete reality of power lines and pipelines, and the collision is producing something that neither side fully anticipated and that neither side is entirely prepared for. The pressure is building in ways that are not yet visible in the daily news cycle. Grid operators are quietly running contingency scenarios. Energy traders are watching Canadian export data with unusual attention. Intelligence analysts are updating their risk assessments. The machinery of potential crisis is in motion, even as the public conversation remains focused on tariff percentages and trade deficit numbers. And here in the gap between the public conversation and the real strategic picture is where the most important question sits. Not whether Canada will actually use the energy weapon, not whether the U.S. grid will actually collapse, but whether two countries that built the most successful bilateral relationship in modern history are truly prepared to continue down a path where those scenarios are no longer unthinkable, where they are, in fact, being quietly calculated and contingency planned by serious people in serious rooms. This changes everything, because once a weapon is seen, it cannot be unseen. Once a leverage point is identified, it becomes part of every negotiation, even when it is never explicitly named. The energy card is now on the table between Canada and the United States, not because Canada necessarily intends to play it, but because the tariff war made it impossible to pretend it does not exist. And that is the shift that happened, not in the last news cycle, not in the last press conference, in the last 24 hours of a trade war that is quietly becoming something far more complicated than anyone announced it would be. The question now is not who blinks first. The question is whether anyone in a position of decision-making authority on either side of this border fully understands what is at stake before the situation moves from a negotiation into something that cannot be walked back with a phone call or a press release. The future is not certain, but it is increasingly dangerous, and the lights that Americans take for granted every night they flip a switch are, in ways that most people have never been asked to consider, dependent on a relationship that is under more strain right now than at any point in living memory. What happens next? Does Washington recalibrate before the energy leverage becomes unavoidable? Does Ottawa hold the card or play it? And if the grid falters, even briefly, even partially, does the calculation on both sides finally change? Those are not rhetorical questions. Those are the questions that the next 72 hours may begin to answer. If this opened your eyes to something real, share this video. The people making these decisions count on the public not understanding what is actually at stake. Understanding is the first line of defense.